Hi, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be. My name is Nigel Asquith. I'm Director of the Kinship Conservation Fellows Program. I'm very happy today to start off this discussion and introduce you all to Ricardo Bayon, who you all already know, presumably from previous webinars, and Zach Knight. We're just talking about the fires in California. I actually live on the edge of the Amazon basin, and we get smoke too. We just started the last couple of days, so I can't go out either. So Zach, I'm very pleased to meet you, and I hope you're going to give us a solution to all of our problems, not just California's problems. So with that,
thank you.
I'll pass you to Ricardo. Thanks again, gentlemen, for being here. I look forward to listening to what you guys got to say.
Well, thank you, Nigel. As Nigel points out, we're talking today about what has quickly become a really big issue, not just in the US, but in the Amazon, in Russia, in Australia, pretty much all over the world. And to me, it's just striking how, many years ago, people who were warning us about the effects of climate change and the problems that would come from climate change, we're talking about all these droughts and burns and things like that. And, as one goes, oh yeah, that's a terrible problem, but, I'll probably never live to see it. Well, we're living to see it. Both Zach and I live in California, where we've had some horrible smoke days. It doesn't compare to people whose houses have burned, for sure. And I feel terrible for people like that. But, we've had awful days, and coming on the heels as it did of the whole COVID lockdown, where the only thing you could do, the only place you could go was to go outside. And then all of a sudden you couldn't go outside because of the terrible air quality. And then to think that it's been 4 million plus acres, and we may even hit, closer to the 5 million mark before this is over, because these fires started way earlier than the fire season normally starts. 4 million acres, that, to put it in context, might not be big from an Amazon perspective, Nigel, but from a US perspective, that's like 4 or 5 states of Rhode Island's worth of burn, and a huge percentage of California's forest. And I think what has happened is like so many things these days, this issue of fire has become politicized. And you hear some people saying, oh, it's the Democratic governors of California who are mismanaging the state, and other people saying, oh, it's only climate change, and climate change is the real problem, and it's the fact that Republicans haven't done anything around climate change. And I think that doesn't help anybody, because at the end of the day, it'd be great, Zach, if you can give us a sort of, first, tell us a little bit more about who you are, and I'll do a little bit of an introduction, but then we can get into sort of the details of what is really underpinning a lot of these problems, and then talk about some of the solutions and the conservation finance solutions. But, thinking about how it's both climate change and land management and decisions that have been taken over the last 100 years, some for very good reasons. And it's true that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. The road to this particular hell has been paved with some good intentions. But let's dig into these. I'd say we're extremely happy to have Zach with us. Zach is the founder and CEO of a group called Blue Forests Conservation, and Blue Forest kind of emerged around an idea to address fires using conservation finance, which he'll tell us a lot about. I've known Zach for many years, and he's always been an innovator in this space, and thinking about new ways, new approaches, and new things to do. And he has been extremely effective at talking not just with government representatives and NGOs, but with the business community. And he has sort of the financial chops to do it, having spent some time at one of the big banks, whom we won't mention, but he has the banking chops as well. So as well as the conservation ethos. So Zach, tell us a little bit about Blue Forest and how you got involved in this.
Yeah, absolutely, Ricardo. I'm happy to. And you can say the name of the bank. It was Merrill Lynch for many years. We just don't say Bank of America for all those reasons. No, that's great. And Ricardo, thank you for the wonderful introduction. By way for everybody else, my name is Zach Knight, and I'm co-founder and CEO of Blue Forest Conservation. As Ricardo noted, I do come from a finance background. I spent the better part of a decade working on Wall Street, and it was a pretty even mix of financial engineering, structured finance, working with mortgage products, credit derivatives, things of that nature. And then my last 4 years, I was just a regular way high yield and distressed bond trader. So working in the corporate bond space, and actually really focused on, unfortunately, the oil and gas and more traditional energy sector. So when you put together the structured finance from the mortgage markets and the CDOs, and then you put together oil and gas investing, I probably had the least sustainable career path of anybody in the financial sector that you could come with. And at the heart of it, I wanted to be doing something good with this financial skill set, which I'll say is quite rare for the financial sector. That's why I think I connected with Ricardo so strongly from the beginning of this. So my transition point, and I think this is probably a thing worth talking about here, for me, it was business school. I left Wall Street and I moved out west and I got my MBA at Berkeley. And then this actually started as a school project, which is a pretty fun story. Ricardo had mentored myself and a classmate through a competition the year before. It was run by Morgan Stanley and Kellogg, and it's called the Sustainable Investment Challenge. And the idea behind it is to come up with any new financial structure or fund that furthers sustainability really in any way whatsoever. The kicker is it has to be institutionally investable, meaning that a pension plan, a bank, an insurance company, something like that could actually make an investment in this. It's not a concessional product. It's not too small. It's not only for foundations. And it was actually the second year in that competition, after Ricardo had helped us with a great fisheries project the first year, where I said, Ricardo, boy, do I have an idea for you. And I started sharing it with him, and it had actually was something Ricardo had been working on for the better part of a decade and had a report coming out on shortly thereafter. So we went through the competition. We were really fortunate enough to win the whole thing. There was about 130 teams from 70 different business schools around the world. So it was great. And then we actually partnered with Ricardo and one other person to try to bring this all together. And I think what ended up being really helpful for Blue Forest perspective was this was the only thing that we focused on. We just wanted to try to take this vision that really started with Ricardo and a lot of the great science that had been done to date and say, how can we, standing on the shoulders of others, really get this across the goal line and make this work? And in full disclosure, that's why Ricardo is one of my board members, because when you have an idea like this and we can work together to make something like that happen, that's someone that you want to have with you at the table for the foreseeable future. So perhaps I'll leave it there and then we can jump into some other pieces of this.
Yeah, we've been sort of teasing with the idea. I think it's time to jump into it and explain it in detail. Maybe before we do, let's put some context on the fires. I know the ones here in the U.S. better than you do perhaps the ones in Russia or the Amazon or Australia. But let's put some context on the news that many people are seeing around the crazy fires in California, and maybe you can tell us what the problems are, and then jump into the idea that Blue Forest is trying and how it tries to solve or address some of those problems.
Yeah, I think that's great, Ricardo. And we get asked all the time about the wildfires in Indonesia and in the Amazon and Brazil. And one thing's really common with those fires, they're often slash and burn agriculture. So someone's actively trying to start those fires to clear land. And it's a really different issue than what we see in California. So a couple of things for context that I think people need to be aware of. There's a lot of forest land in California. There's north of 20 million acres of forest land, and the majority of that is actually owned and managed by the federal government. The U.S. Forest Service is the agency that manages the vast majority of this. There's obviously some national park system land and some BLM land in the state of California too. What's interesting is
the Bureau of Land Management, by the way, for those outside the U.S.
Yes, exactly. And one of the things that's really challenging for the state of California is that they don't own much, if any, of this land. The state has something called state responsibility area, which means they're responsible for fighting the fires on land that's not National Forest System land, which is what's managed by the U.S. Forest Service, again, a federal agency. And that presents a real problem for the state because they don't often have access to all the land that needs to be managed. And they do work really closely with the Forest Service. But when you think about the ecological drivers of this issue, it really goes back about 100 to 150 years and has a lot to do with bringing European forest management practices out west to a system that had been managed by indigenous people for tens of thousands of years and was really working quite well. for folks that know less about the U.S. Forest Service was created to obviously protect and preserve a lot of our national forests across the country, but it was really a driver of economic growth in the beginning. When you think about how the West was built, it was built on railroads, which required a lot of timber to make that. So after 30 to 40 years of the U.S. Forest Service being in existence, it started right in 1905, we had something that was known as the 10 a.m. rule. And what that meant was that the Forest Service wanted to extinguish any fire that started by 10 a.m. the next day. Why would we want to do something like this if we know fire is a natural part of the ecosystem? And back in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, there weren't a lot of people that lived in what's known as the wildland-urban interface, which is that area in and around the forest, not completely in the forest, but it tends to burn more frequently. So if we don't have people living there, why did we want to stop the fire? The simple reason was that we saw all of that as taxpayer dollars. Every one of those trees was taxpayer dollars and could be more of that driver of economic growth, which we were really focused on as a country. The Forest Service started to realize this, and starting as far back as the 1960s and 70s, they started looking at forest restoration projects. And this has been documented for 40 or 50 years of what we can do as land managers on our public land to start to reduce the risk of this catastrophic wildfire. And again, thinking about the drivers of this, why are we having such bad fires here? The first is that we stopped all the fires. And what that led to was now our national forests have up to 10 times as many trees as would be naturally occurring. And actually, too many trees can be a bad thing because it's this overgrowth when you combine it with an increasingly hotter and drier climate that has led to the record-breaking fires that we've had this year. But it's not just this year. 2019 was relatively light. We had the deadliest fire season in California history. In 2018, we had the most expensive fire season in US history in 2017. So again, unfortunately, this is not an anomaly. It's much more of a trend from that perspective. But I did mention one thing, Ricardo, that I want to share a little bit more. We actually know what we need to do on these landscapes. We just don't appropriate or allocate the funding to do it. So in a lot of ways, this is no longer a science problem. It's actually a finance problem, saying, how can we bring more money to do more of this work in the forest that we really understand and we know that it works?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's interesting to think how because we wanted to stop all the fires initially, and we've had 100+ years of a fire management regime that stops all fires, even small fires, you get to this overgrowth. So when fire does happen, it's just explosive, huge, big, burns more of the forest, burns the understory, burns basically everything, right?
Yeah.
And I do think, yes, we know what we need to do, but at the same time, you have a problem in the U.S. Forest Service, at least, and possibly elsewhere, that you get into this vicious cycle, right? You get into the cycle where you have two budgets, right? One budget is fire prevention, and I'm simplifying, of course, and one budget is firefighting. And over the years, what's the percentage of the U.S. Forest Service budget that now goes to firefighting?
Yeah, it's a great question. So actually, if you went back just to 1995, you actually saw this budget was 15 or 16%. You can say hi to my dad here too, guys. You can say hi to Ricardo if you want. So back to that. It was about 15% of the Forest Service budget in 1995. And I mentioned the most expensive fire season so far, and this year will break all of those records, was 2017, where the Forest Service spent $2.7 billion fighting fires, or about 56% of their budget. So this has gone from 15% to 56%, and it will be well over 2/3, I would imagine, this year, given all of the firefighting.
So, you're getting to close to 75% of the Forest Service budget fighting fires. That money is not allocated by Congress, so they have to pull it from somewhere. They pull it from the fire prevention budget. And guess what? Next year, it gets worse. So you get into this vicious cycle. And, let's talk now about the idea that you're working on. But I'll just say that when it started at a very simplistic level, what we were talking about was turning that vicious cycle on its head and saying, what if we could borrow from future firefighting to pay for fire prevention now? How would that look like? What would we do? And we talked about, hey, let's get private investors to put money in. And if it prevents a fire, to put money in to clear the forest, to do what you need to do to prevent a fire. And if it helps and if it works, get a pay for success structure that would effectively say, the Forest Service or whoever will pay the private investors. And there you're switching from a vicious cycle to a virtuous one, where in fact you're borrowing from future firefighting to pay for fire prevention. Now, that was at a very simplistic level the original idea. As we know, that is not what we're talking about now, or at least not exactly. It has elements of it. But tell us, how has that pivot, how has that changed, and where are you now, and how does it work?
Absolutely. And Ricardo, remind me to come back to pay for success, because it's not a big part of our model right now, but I do think it's really interesting for the audience to understand why didn't we go that way? What were some of the barriers? But I want to dig into the Forest Resilience Bond a little bit first. So again, at Blue Forest Conservation, we really have only developed one product, and it's the Forest Resilience Bond, and that's what we're going to focus our conversation today. And what it is a public-private partnership that allows private capital from groups like insurance companies and pension plans, but also foundations making concessionary investments in this work to cover the upfront costs required to do this forest restoration work. We'll talk a little bit more about what this ecological restoration entails in just a few moments here. But the goal of that work, as Ricardo's pointing out here, is it's designed to reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfire. And actually, some of this work is actually putting new fire on the ground, because that can, again, limit the risk of catastrophic wildfire in the future. But in doing that work, we actually create a tremendous amount of co-benefits for other groups. For example, 65% of California's developed water supply actually comes from snowpack in these forested watersheds. So if we don't have a system that works, we're going to imperil our water supply in the state of California. And as you all know, we've had the worst drought in 1,200 years about 5 years ago, and it dramatically impacts everything from agriculture to residential water use, right? So water supply is an important part of this, but when there's fires, there can be post-fire flooding and sediment that can be a really expensive thing for a utility to deal with. So there's a strong case for why utilities should be at the table. In addition to that, this creates jobs in an area where unemployment is very, very high. We're working right now in Sierra County in California. Pre-COVID, the unemployment rate was 15.5% as compared to about 2.6% statewide unemployment rate at that time. So we do have this rural-urban divide that this helps. And lastly, the thing that we started this conversation with is air quality. And I think this is going to be a big driver of value in the future. So what we do with the Forest Resilience Bond is we allow all of these beneficiaries, the Forest Service, but also water and electric utilities, flood control districts, state agencies, and even private companies like brewers or bottlers to sign contracts or agreements based on the benefits that they receive from this project happening. And when you put that all together, that ultimately repays our investors with a modest rate of return. So that's what we've done. The funding and the financing comes from the comes from the private sector, whereas the funding from these projects largely actually comes from the public sector in a variety of single-year or multi-year commitments.
So if we're thinking about this from a financial flows perspective, I guess what it looks like is you say, okay, we need to do something on the land to prevent or lessen the risk or the severity of wildfires. You know, that includes, clearing some of the understory, maybe putting some controlled burns, some controlled fires on the ground, doing things like that. That costs money. That can be extremely expensive. The government, the Forest Service tries to do that, but it doesn't always have the budget that's necessary. So what we'll do is we'll go to private investors and say, you pay for it up front, and you'll get paid back after a certain amount of time if certain criteria are met. You'll get paid back by this coalition that you're talking about, which includes the Forest Service, the utilities, the brewers, everybody like that, right? How was that received when you first proposed it to investors?
Yeah, it's a great question. So again, to Ricardo's point, this really is a public-private partnership in that you have federal government, you have state government, you have municipal or local government as a part of it as well, which is a really hard thing to do, but you end up with a better product because you have to get everybody on the same page from that perspective. So while a lot of these stakeholders all want to see the risk of catastrophic wildfire reduced, they do have somewhat different incentives from that perspective. In terms of the investment, the way we structured this is actually as a loan. And one of the things that we've seen in the ecosystem service marketplace, if you will, or in the world of payment for ecosystem services, is that there can be a lot of variability in what groups pay for those ecosystem services. And if you are a lender or a fixed income investor, you have to model out all of those different payments and how that could come together. And there ends up being a lot of risk in structures like that. So we wanted to take a little bit of a different tact here, and we actually worked with the federal government, the state government, and local municipalities to say, how do you contribute to these projects currently, and can we build a financing structure around what already exists? And what we ended up with at the end of the day was basically 3 streams of cash flows from those different parties, the Forest Service, the state, and the utility, and we set what those were going to be up front. And a lot of times we see this sometimes in the mitigation banking space or otherwise, the investor takes on the risk of, will this intervention work first and foremost, and will someone actually want to buy the credit at the end of the day? Because we already know this intervention works, and because we get everybody to sign contracts or agreements on day one, we take a lot of risk out of that structure for the investors. And I think that's a really, really big part of this. We also want to be smart about who our investors are, Ricardo, and I think this is a big point. We have worked with the Department of Insurance in the state of California. We do have an insurance company as an investor, and not too surprisingly, insurance companies are going to be motivated to see this landscape scale restoration take place because it's going to start to reduce what they have to pay out at the end of the day. So I think we're going to see strong interest from impact investors, the foundation community making what's known as program related investments or below market rate investments that are aligned with their program or their charitable purpose. That's a big tool that's frequently used here in the US for below market rate financing. And we actually bring those together. So we have insurance companies that earn a market rate. We have foundations that get a below market rate. And when you blend that together, it's a much lower rate than the municipality or the federal government could achieve on these projects. Last thing to mention here, this was really the first product that could proactively reduce risk, prevent wildfire, protect our public lands. And I think there was a lot of interest from the investment community in that factor, that aspect of it, Ricardo, because we haven't seen that before. And I think everybody in their heart, whether you're Democrat or Republican, you do love our public lands and the conservation that we try to do in this country. And if you can invest in it and earn a return, that's a pretty meaningful proposition to a number of these groups.
I think what's really interesting there's 2 very important concepts that you've talked about. One is, the types of investors, and rather than structuring it as some other complicated structure, you set it up as a straightforward loan. And I think in the conservation finance space, we sometimes overlook debt instruments and loans because they're just, too simple and maybe not sexy enough. And yet, if you look globally, the biggest chunk of finance out there is in debt instruments of some sort, right? Bonds are bigger than all the stock markets in the world. They're bigger than almost any other type of structure out there. So I think one important lesson here for people in conservation is do not forget the lowly loan, because loans can be, extremely versatile, extremely powerful. And there are a lot of investors that want to invest in loans. And not only that, but the biggest money in the world generally is looking to put money into loans. When you're looking at insurers, when you're looking at big institutional investors like pension funds, a lot of the money they put in is in debt structures, whether it's bonds or loans or things like that. So loan is one point. The other point is the capital stack that you've created, right? And the different interests in the capital stack leads you to being able to put them together in such a way that you have those that are taking higher risk, but therefore require higher return, those that are willing to take risk, but don't need a huge return, like the philanthropies and the foundations. And then they're subsidizing the risk and subsidizing in some way the return as part of their charitable giving or part of their wanting to accomplish a mission of the foundation. And how you structure that is interesting, and how you get to a point where all of a sudden the risk return profile is the right risk return profile for an investor. And I think this is something that we've talked about in previous ones of these, how there's really 2 very big dials in the investment community that I call greed and fear, but they're called risk and return. And how you change that and how you modify that to get an investor interested, either by increasing the greed, i.e. the return, or decreasing the fear, i.e. the risk, that makes a huge difference in how you structure this. So I think that those are 2 very important lessons. I don't know if you can tell us a little bit of more details of how that played out in real life.
Yeah, I do want to talk about this, and I love that analogy, Ricardo. I'm going to steal that for my SOCAP panels next week when we talk about financial structuring. But I think Ricardo's on to a great point. And one thing I want to come back to is the loan piece. Ricardo's exactly right. I think it's by a factor of 2 to 1 that there's more fixed income or debt out there than all of the stock markets in the world combined. And I know when you look at Apple as a $2 trillion company, it's hard to believe there's that much more debt out there, but there is. So it is much more common. And when you start to think about what we need to do on the landscape to do landscape scale restoration, we're going to be looking at a lot of different ecosystem services and understanding what are the benefits. Well, those intermittent or variable or continuous cash flows from ecosystem services from a variety of payers, as we've lined up in the Forest Resilience Bond, that lends itself really, really well to debt because you have a constant stream of cash flow with some degree of variability. And I think that's where this market's going to go when you start to look at more landscape restoration, whether you're trying to solve the fire problem or riparian restoration, salmon habitat. That's another thing the Forest Service has really asked us to look into, using a kind of the same model to do some of that. I think that's a really important piece of this. And then when you go to groups that might benefit from this landscape scale restoration in a non-traditional way, so not your utility that's at the bottom of the watershed, but again, that insurance company, I think this is the right time for groups like that to start thinking about how could we structure these investments to reduce risk, to make that cost of capital as low as possible. And the reason I say now is the time, what's different today than it was a year ago, 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago? There's really only one thing, and it's interest rates. Interest rates are negative in some parts of Europe. They're near zero in the United States here. So when you work in the fixed income context, you price everything versus treasuries, which again have sort of trended towards zero here, meaning that the cost of doing this is never going to be cheaper from an interest rate perspective. And I'm happy to talk more about that if that didn't make sense right off the bat. But I do want to pivot a little bit, Ricardo, to your structure question. And I think this is the thing that we look at. We don't look at the greed dial as much. I don't have a lot of excess cash flow in these structures with which to pay more of a rate of return. So I think of the risk or the fear. How can I turn that down? And I want to just give everybody one quick example. And if this is interesting, we can dig in more, Ricardo. But in this structure, the greatest risk to our investors is that the whole project burns down. And then what happens to your money? If I'm holding onto your money and I'm paying contractors and all this. We knew that from day one, so we started to structure around that. And the way our product works is that we actually don't take all the money from investors on day one. We actually only draw down on that capital from investors as we need it to pay the contractors that are out in the field doing this work. As that work is completed, I've already got payback tied in from the state of California. They say, if you do this work, we'll pay you X for it, right? So even if the project were to burn down, every dollar I've taken from my investors, it has a payback associated with it, such that if we had to stop the project tomorrow because it burned down, my investors would actually still be able to get all their money out of this project. And they wouldn't be able to do that if they had just given us all $4 million and we started paying folks and doing a whole bunch of other things without that payback tied to it. So that's a really good example of how you can turn that risk knob down in a way that makes sense. The other piece of this that maybe this will make more sense from a mitigation banking standpoint is we get all those contracts signed from day one. So I'm not borrowing money from investors and going out and trying to get those contracts signed. And that is a materially different risk profile than what you see in other sectors of conservation finance, where it really is venture capital. You're hoping that this venture is successful and that you're able to sell whatever the credits and other things that come out of it. So it's really different when you have the payback all lined up from day one. And that's what allows us to be in this fixed income space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, talk a little bit about how big the first pilot is, because I know you guys are working in a pilot, as you said, up in the Sierras around Lake Tahoe, right?
Yep.
Basically doing this. How big? Who were the players? You know, how did it come to be? Tell us a little bit more of the details.
Yeah, I might ask Brendan to throw the slides up. I just have 2 slides for folks that are watching, but the first one I can orient you all as to where this is happening. You can skip this first slide, Brendan. Okay, so the folks can see, you see Lake Tahoe down in the lower right corner. The green outline is the Tahoe National Forest. The grayed out area is the Yuba River Ranger District. And the red area is our project area. And really interesting, since launching this project, I'll tell you more about the stats of it in just a moment. Since we launched this project, it was actually on Halloween of 2018, a group of stakeholders has come together in this watershed and has said, we love what's happening on the 15,000 acres in that project area. We want to extend this program to cover the entire watershed, which is just over 300,000 acres. And this is really our strategy with the Forest Resilience Bond, is to say, can we start it in a critical watershed and then expand the program with the same stakeholders, the same contracts, the same investors, same structure? Because at the end of the day, while what we're doing is really innovative and new and exciting, we actually want to get it to boring. Fixed income is supposed to be boring, and if we really want to see a lot of money coming into these projects, we need to transition that and really make this stuff boring. In terms of the stats here, this is a 15,000 acre project with about 6,000 treatment acres within that area. That means you're protecting 15,000 acres by treating 6,000 acres within that boundary. And as Ricardo mentioned, those treatments include hand and mechanical thinning, cutting down small trees, usually less than 10 or 12 inches in diameter. Actually doing a broadcast burn or prescribed fire, which is intended to reinvigorate the natural fire cycle that is in this area and does burn. This is an area that's supposed to burn every 10 to 30 years. And we haven't seen a fire here in over 100 years, just to show you how far departed we are from that perspective. So we're excited to not only finish up this project, but actually start to move on to the next project in this watershed, while also trying to seed a number of these projects in other key watersheds, not only across California, but really across the Western US, with a heavy focus on Oregon and Washington. Brandon, if you go to the next slide, I'll give some more stats. We'll talk about the return. And I want to make sure folks can see, because we can actually see who all the stakeholders are on this graphic. So at the end of the day, this pilot project was just $4 million. So sizable, somewhat sizable from the conservation finance space, but tiny, tiny, tiny from an investor's perspective. And that does matter, because each one of these investors worked with us for about 2 or 3 months before making this investment to understand how everything would work. And each one of these investors was only able to put in $1 million. I'm going to pick on one of my investors, AAA Insurance. You know, they're a small insurance company, but they still manage $9 billion. So to go to someone that manages $9 billion and convince them to invest just a single $1 million is a lot more challenging than if this was a $40 million project and they could have made a $10 million investment. And again, keeping the greed and fear knobs exactly where they are, size is actually a really helpful thing for the investor community. So I wanted to call that out. The term of this investment is 5 years, and we expect it'll take us 4 years to complete all the work on the ground. So these different stakeholders have different terms in which they pay in. I'll talk through that as we walk through this structure, but this will be wrapped up in 5 years, 3 years from now. But the nice thing is it doesn't have to finish before you start the next project in the watershed. And I think that's a really critical point, because our next project will be about 8 years. And again, that doesn't need to finish before the next one kicks off and work gets underway from that perspective. So I'm going to start on the box on the top. These are our investors. We have 2 market rate investors, Calvert Impact Capital. They happen to be a nonprofit impact investor, and they're often seen in a lot of ways as, even though they're small, they only manage about $500 million, really the gold standard when it comes to impact investing, especially in the debt space. They only invest in debt, and they're absolutely experts. AAA Insurance, as I mentioned, an insurance company, they manage about $9 billion, and they have portfolios across the board. They invest in equity, debt, and everything in between. Then on the foundation side, our 2 biggest supporters, and really, I guess I call them founding funders from that perspective, are the Rockefeller Foundation and the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. And they have funded our work at Blue Forest. I don't know if I mentioned this, but we are a nonprofit, a 501c3 nonprofit, to help figure out how we might do this. How can we get everyone together? And then they were very eager to also be investors in the project. And Ricardo mentioned the below market rate financing they provide. Here in the US, there's a tax law that allows for what's known as program related investments. And again, those foundations can count that as the 5% that they need to grant out and give every year. And as soon as I return that capital, they just get to grant it out again. So it's a really great tool here, because it allows the foundations to achieve that impact, but then get that money back and loan it out again or grant it out again and continue to achieve impact. The difference in return was material. We paid 4% to our market rate investors and 1% to our concessional investors. And we did price this, not to get too nerdy here, but we priced this off the 2-year treasury, which was at almost 3% when we did this project in October of 2018. And for those who don't follow the treasury market, it's at less than 1/4% right now. So the interest rate market, again, has come down massively, which means the next time we do this, we might be able to fund this at 2% for the market rate investors and 0.5% for those concessional lenders. So to take you through this, everybody's on the same loan agreement, everybody's pari passu, they all have the same remedies and an event of default, all of those kind of things. The only difference really is the rate of return.
Pari passu, Zach.
Oh, sorry. It means that they get their money at the same time. They're taking the same amount of risk. Ricardo mentioned structures where you can have different investors taking different amounts of risk, and we did start that way. We ended up having all our investors taking commensurate risk in this, meaning that they're pari passu. They take losses the same time, they receive cash flow the same time. They're considered the same seniority from that perspective. So we draw down on these lenders as we need to. We get to draw twice a year. And then we pass that funding through this investment vehicle. This is called the Forest Resilience Bond. And it's simply an LLC that's set up in the state of California where this work is taking place. For tax purposes.
That's a limited liability corporation.
Correct. Yes. Thank you, Ricardo. And that's very common for what we use in structured finance as a special purpose vehicle, or an SPV is a term you might hear. The reason that we do that, and it's very, very specific, is to create both accountability and transparency, not just for the investors, as many people think, but actually for all the stakeholders. If you're the Yuba Water Agency, you don't want Zach and the Blue Forest team to take your money and go do a project in the state of Oregon, if the Yuba Water Agency, for those who don't know, is right here in California. And it's the same thing for the investors. They want to know where their money's being used, and they want to know what it's being used for. A lot of people ask us, why don't you do green bond certification? And I say, in a lot of ways, we kind of go through that whole process by disclosing all of our sources and uses to all these different stakeholders. So again, that transparency of an individual investment vehicle for each deal is of critical importance to making this work, so you're not commingling funds and a whole bunch of other things. So we draw that money into the Forest Resilience Bond, and then we lend it out to a group called the National Forest Foundation. They are the congressionally chartered nonprofit partner of the Forest Service, and they manage lots of projects on behalf of the Forest Service. They do trail restoration work, they do this ecological restoration work in our national forests. And what we say is, for every forest that we work in, and we're working in almost 12.5 of them right now, we ask that forest, who do you want to implement the project? It's never the forest, but it doesn't always have to be the National Forest Foundation. There's a number of other nonprofits that partner with the Forest Service to complete these projects. So to allow them to do that, we lend them money at a 0% interest rate, and then we grant them money on top of that, which may sound a little bit crazy because now I'm giving money away and I'm earning a 0% return on the money that I'm lending them. The reason we do that is this: both the grant agreement from the state of California and any dollars that come from the Forest Service from a statutory basis can't be used to pay interest. Plus, we don't want the National Forest Foundation to have to pay interest. We want to give them full financial flexibility, pay contractors on time, get this work done more quickly. We're trying to accelerate how quickly we do this, right? So to ultimately make a return for the investor.
And just to pause there, Zach, because I think this is an important point. There are laws in the U.S. that prevent the state of California and the federal government through the Forest Service to pay interest on these sorts of things. Now, those could change, maybe not in this Congress, but they could change at some point, in which case you could potentially charge interest. But right now you're working with the laws you have, which make it impossible for them to pay interest.
And I'm actually, to be honest with you, this is going to sound crazy, but as I finish up the structure, I think it'll make sense to folks. I'm less concerned about being able to charge interest in this loan to NFF. I really want them, as the project manager, they're our general contractor for folks. They manage every aspect of the project on the ground. I don't really want them to have to think about paying interest or when they borrow from me in all of those things. On a sort of federal policy standpoint, I'm much more interested in the Forest Service being able to make 20-year commitments to much larger projects. And that's because, to Ricardo's point, we also sign a contract with the water agency. And in this case, they're a water agency, they're a hydropower producer, and they're a flood control entity, meaning that this could be 3 separate contracts and actually will be in one of our future projects. And they're paying in this case, $1.5 million over the course of 5 years, or $300,000 a year. And we actually use that money to pay interest to investors, to cover the operating costs of this. We have to do an audit every year. We create an impact report every year. That costs money. It's $30,000 a year in this setup. So we'll, over the life of this, we'll spend about $150,000 in interest expense, $150,000 in operating expense, and then the other $1.2 million that comes into this structure will actually just be granted to the National Forest Foundation to complete all the work on the landscape. So we knew we'd have to provide a return from the investors, but we also knew that we couldn't get it from the state or the federal government. So in a lot of ways, this model requires that additional payer. And in many cases, I think it may be 2, 3, or 4 additional payers, not just the one that you see here.
All right. So I have a couple more questions, but I want to prime people to type their questions into the question box on the side so we can jump to your questions. And the way that'll work is I will see the questions. I'm not seeing any now, if there are any up there. But if you type your question in there, I will call on you. You will be unmuted and you'll get to ask your question of Zach. So please start thinking about and typing in your questions there on the sidebar. One interesting thing, Zach, is that in the beginning we thought maybe Blue Forest or something like it could be a for-profit company. I know that's not the way it turned out. Again, here's another lesson for people in the conservation finance space. There's always a pivot. You start off with one idea, no battle plan survives contact with the enemy, and you have had to pivot multiple times to get this thing done and happening. And one of the pivots was that Blue Forest is not a for-profit company now. It is a nonprofit company,
That's right.
or nonprofit organization. Can you tell us about that pivot and how that came to be and why that made sense?
Absolutely. So I think coming out of business school, the only way to convince classmates to work with you would be on a for-profit venture from that standpoint. But that's all joking from my perspective. So it's a weird transition, and it was helped by the fact that we didn't take on any private investment in the early stage of our organization. In fact, we worked closely with Ricardo to get some grant funding, even as a for-profit, so that we could test this out. And the reason we wanted to go for grant funding is what we were trying to do hadn't been done before. And in fact, Ricardo had this idea for many years and actually went around and interviewed a handful of other folks that had worked on a similar idea that hadn't worked out. So this was so risky that I don't think we could have gone to a venture capital firm and said, look, this is what we're trying to do. You should fund this work. Also, there's not enough of a return to this. I told you we make $30,000 a year from this one project. It costs us about $3 million to put it together. So start thinking about it from that perspective. And it won't cost that much in the future. A lot of that was getting the Forest Service in the state of California on board with being part of a financing like this for the first time ever, which I think is really challenging for a whole bunch of reasons. But back to the nonprofit status. So there were 3 reasons that drove our interest in transitioning from a for-profit to a nonprofit. There was a very specific tax reason, which I won't get into with the way we've structured these investments. I don't think it's super interesting from that standpoint. The second was that at the end of the day, this is not a massively profitable thing that we're doing here. I think there's a place where we could break even financially or have what would look like a profit, but I want to be a nonprofit because if we're able to generate any of that profit, that just means it's retained earnings. It stays in our business. We can then invest in something else, hire more people, continue to build this thing. So again, thinking about Ricardo's conversations about, or topics about virtuous cycles, that's really what we want to create with Blue Forest. And then the last one, and I think this is the most important one, is that when you are a nonprofit, it is much easier to partner with government at every level. And what we found was that, again, spending those first 3 years convincing people that finance had a role to play in this solution, the biggest challenge they had was, well, these are all professional investors. They're going to rip us off. We don't want to work with investors. And everybody thought every investor is a hedge fund, which is a incredibly small part of the investment universe. So it took a long time to get them to understand that, hey, I'm actually on your side here, because my motivation is not to maximize my return to my investors. Again, my investors are lenders. They have a stated rate of return. It can't change. It can only go lower, right? My goal is actually to set up as many of these projects as I can, because that will achieve the impact that our organization wants to. And I think taking that tactic, as opposed to saying, I want to maximize return for my investors, just because of the nature of the investment that we're doing, that has lent itself to doing this as a nonprofit and garnering a lot more support from state and other groups, because they see us as working in their interest to try to make these projects as low cost as possible to the stakeholders. Because again, that's my goal. The cheaper this is, the more of these things we can do, and the better off the ecosystems that we're working in will be.
So fast forward and take us to like what is the ideal outcome of all of this, and how does this, you know, help prevent a fire year like the one we're having now? And if all goes well, where do you see this ending up?
Yep, and these numbers are going to sound crazy because I told you the first project was only $4 million, but across the United States, and really specifically focused in the Western US where this risk exists in its most significant way, the Forest Service has identified a backlog of over $100 billion of these ecological restoration projects. Again, not $100 million, $100 billion. And again, when you think about how much the Forest Service is able to spend on this, they spend about $500 million a year. So if we make the ridiculous assumption that forests will stop growing and stop burning, it would take the agency about 200 years to get through this backlog of restoration work that they need to complete in these Western forests. So that is our total addressable market. We whittled that down by doing some analysis of what could be treated, where is the highest fire risk, and then indexing that with where is the most valuable source water. And we came up with about $8 billion total addressable market in the highest fire risk and the highest water scarcity or importance. Both of those are provided by the US Forest Service. If you expand that just to moderate, it gets to about $40 billion, so it jumps up pretty quickly. Our goal over the next 5 to 6 years would be to grow this so that we have about $300 million of these forest resilience bonds out there, and that's when we start to break even as an organization. I think we can do a lot more than that, but it really does take a lot of time to bring these projects together, create the social license that exists on the landscape, and get all these stakeholders taking steps in the same direction together. But once you've seen it, again, it's much easier to do the second one. The second project in that watershed should be about $16 million. And will be a quarter of the work of putting the first one together. So there really is this big negative cash flow situation that we generate by doing all this work that gets paid off down the road as more of that income comes back to us. And it's just a really hard thing to finance because we don't have equity to sell like every other venture does. So something to consider.
Yeah, I think this is just, that bears repeating. You break even when you are doing $300 million worth of these deals. You know, people think these things are, oh great, it's gonna, you know, turn up a ton of money for everybody concerned. But you know, even as a nonprofit, you're gonna have to grow this pretty considerably from your $4 million, 100-fold almost, yep, before you start breaking even on something like this. So, that's right. And in terms of actually addressing the underlying problem, the world you foresee where you're doing billions of dollars of forest resilience bond, or somebody is, how does that help us in the long run? What changes on the landscape? What does it look like?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a great question. So what we're trying to do is to make our landscape more resilient to fire in the way that it has been in the past. And actually, one of the great programs we've plugged in with, the Forest Service does, they use dendrochronology, or looking at tree rings, to understand what our forests look like before Europeans arrived. And that's what we're really trying to replicate. We are adjusting a little bit from a climate adaptation standpoint to understand that it's 2.5 degrees hotter in California than it was in 1950 or 1960. So some of those species will change. But the bulk of this work on the landscape is to reduce that vegetation, reduce those fuel loads, and actually reinvigorate that natural fire cycle. The other things that will happen on these landscapes, Ricardo, to your point, is the removal of invasive species, decommissioning of old logging roads, which have really, really big sedimentation and water quality issues. And then the last one is restoring meadows. High elevation meadows are some of our best carbon sinks across the state of California. They're also sponges that filter water and hold water. And for a water agency in California, water in April could have a 0 or negative value, whereas water in August might be worth $500 to $1,000 an acre foot. So a massive change if you can just hold some of that water a little bit more from that perspective. So those are all things that are really important, both from an ecological standpoint, but again, carbon, habitat, all of these things, but it makes economic sense to these investors like utilities to put some money up, because if they actually get more water in August than April, hugely beneficial to them. And there's hard economics behind that.
Yeah, no, I think this is also worth repeating in the sense that, there are really positive outcomes from this, from a climate change perspective, from a water perspective, from a biodiversity management perspective. Even though, I think in California you get a lot of pushback against things like prescribed fire, because nobody wants them burning, forest.
Right.
Prescribed fire. So there's been a lot of fights against these types of forest management, which
Absolutely.
also slows things down. And maybe now, after we've all suffered these catastrophic fires, there'll be a little bit more leeway to do that. But yeah, I think it's fascinating to watch how this could have such a ripple effect in lots and lots and lots of different ways.
Absolutely.
So I think that about covers it from my questions. Anything else you want to sort of leave us with in terms of what you've seen, what you've learned, or maybe even how something like this could be applied, A, beyond fire, and B, maybe outside the US, if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I want to come back to Ricardo for one lesson learned that I think would just be really important for everyone to hear, because we've made tons and tons of mistakes. I mean, you talk about pivoting, for-profit, nonprofit was one of them. I mean, it took 16 times before we got that structure into the right feeling from that perspective. So yeah, as we look around, we wanted to stay focused on one thing and one thing only, because I think that gives us the best chance for success. Now that we know how to do that, the Forest Service is actually looking to use this tool in a different way. One of the projects we're working on right now would be a forest health project, but really focusing on riparian corridors, river systems. And these are river systems that are inhabited or had been in the past by a number of different salmon species, which are really important for a cultural resource for indigenous communities that are up in this area. This is in Washington State, but it's really important for the ecosystem. So yeah, anytime we have a proven environmental intervention, Ricardo, that we understand how it works, we can use this structure. The one caveat is you need a multiple stakeholder solution. You need to have 3 or 4 stakeholders coming together to make this financial structure work. It doesn't work with just one. Likewise, we've had a number of conversations in Australia about how a structure like this could be used to both do post-fire remediation, but also preventative work on the front end, where right now the government is the only payer, same way it was with the Forest Service, but there's clearly other groups that would benefit from reducing the severity of the bushfires that we saw last year. And again, I want to put all of this into context for folks. We burned 4 million acres in California. We've set every record on the record book. We had 5 of the top 10 largest fires, and they're all still burning right now, not this year's fires, in all of history. And with that, Australia burned 10 times, I want to say, as much in the bushfires than what we're seeing this year in California, which is, again, record-breaking from that perspective. And versus the prior year was actually 100 times. It just doesn't sound as big because we're an order of magnitude higher on the fire risk this year. The lesson learned too, Ricardo, just to share this quickly, when we work with these other stakeholders, I think a lot of these stakeholders are in some ways kind of sick of environmental groups coming in and saying, hey, you need to be a part of this. You need to put your money in. We're going to either regulate you from a policy perspective or tell you what we think as some big environmental NGO. We took the exact opposite approach. We went and met with these folks and said, hey, we've got some great partners at the UC system, University of California, and at Stanford, as well as partners at the World Resources Institute that help us understand how much this is worth. So instead of saying we're going to do all that analysis somewhere else and then come pitch it to you and really sell you on this idea, we instead do that analysis with the stakeholder. Nobody knows how much an acre foot of water is worth more than the utility you're working with. And if you go pitch them some crazy number, they're never going to believe you, right? You need to work with them, because ultimately, to Ricardo's points, these projects generate so much more value than they cost when you start to take into account the ecosystem services. That in our first project, the economic analysis said almost $9 million of benefit to the utility. And as I mentioned when we were going through the structure, they're only paying $1.5 million in this first project. And I think leaving value on the table would be the other lesson learned as a part of that, but really working with the stakeholders instead of doing your work somewhere else and coming back to them and trying to sell them. I don't think that will work quite as well.
Great, so we're starting to have a few questions pop up. Let's go first to Citali Cortez Montaño. You want to ask your questions, Citali? If we can, we'll unmute you. Are you still there?
Yeah, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Cool. I lost my internet, so I'm on my phone and the computer. Anyway, it's kind of crazy day here in Mexico City. Thank you so much. This is really interesting. I just wanted to clarify if the amount of area that the fund is able to cover for fire management prevention or catastrophic fire management prevention activities. I heard 15,000 acres. Is that correct?
That's the whole project area. So when we plan these projects in the US, they have to go through what's called the National Environmental Policy Act. So they have to say this whole 15,000 acres, what are you going to do on it? What do you think the impacts are going to be? And then we bring the public into that process. So in that 15,000 acre area, we're going to treat about 6,000 of those acres, which means thinning, and then likely on the same acre going back and burning and reintroducing that prescribed fire.
Okay. Okay. Are you familiar with the Forefry initiative in Northern Arizona?
Yes,
yeah.
I'm very familiar.
Okay, cool. So is there any potential connection that you can see between that type of, forest management, which is also like a PPP type of scheme, though it doesn't have the investment component? Like, do you see a potential connection between a Forefry type of project and what you're doing in Tahoe?
Absolutely. And one of the things that Forefry did to say this, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Zach, just maybe you can, for people who don't know the project, maybe you can just give a little brief.
Thank you. So this is a project that's happening in Region 3 of the Forest Service in the state of Arizona. And I might not get all the national forests yet right, but there's 4 of them. It's the Tonto,
Coconino. I think it's a Coconino, the North Kaibab, and the Kaibab, maybe? I went to school at NAU. And I was and I was right there when the Forefry started. So sorry for talking over you.
No worries at all. That was great. Thanks for filling in that context. So the planning area that they're talking about, I said 15,000 acres in our project. For the Forefry initiative, I think it was about 2 to 2.5 million acres for a planning area. And their first stewardship contract that went out covered 600,000 acres. So this was by far one of the largest planning efforts the Forest Service had ever gotten into, and it was certainly the largest stewardship contract we've ever seen in Forest Service history. Unfortunately, one of the big things behind Forefry was there was a belief that if you just leave it to the private market, that all of this small diameter timber would become really valuable and we could create bioenergy and other value-added wood products. And unfortunately, that really hasn't been the case. To Ricardo's earlier points about the Forest Service and how they get the money, traditionally they would sell timber. And in the state of California, in the state of Arizona, and much of the Western US, the timber's not all that valuable anymore. So they need to figure out how else could we fund some of this work. And one of my big issues with the Forefry Collaborative is not the collaborative. I think it's incredible how they bring that many diverse interests together. The bigger problem is the lack of work that's happening on the landscape because there's such a belief that all of this wood is valuable. And I'm going to say something somewhat controversial here, but water in that area, water in the state of California is worth more than the timber's ever going to be worth if you start looking at it that way. And that's actually, we've worked around in Arizona and we've talked about the water issues, and all the utilities have said, well, we're not going to pay for it because all this work pays for itself. So they've created an expectation that this work really is profitable when it's not. And I think that's one of the challenges and one of the things that we need to be a lot more truthful about how much money can you actually generate from timber and these things. I see a lot of models right now that say, hey, the biomass is going to pay for it all. We heavily subsidize that in California, and it doesn't come close to paying for the whole project or even a small portion of it. So I want to try to be realistic with folks from that perspective. And where I think Forefry works best is in well-resourced counties like Coconino County, where they can actually put money in and maybe have even the means of getting in there and starting to manage some of these projects. Did that answer your question? Or
Yeah, I guess I was curious. And Ricardo, please let me know if I'm taking too much time. If there's other questions behind me, I'll
Yeah,
willing to.
there are, but
Okay.
but if you
No,
have a
it's fine.
follow-up, go quickly.
Yeah, it's just if there's a connection between a potential bond of this type of example to make that sort of tie up the for-fry approach better to fund it.
I personally believe there is. I've spent countless hours with that group explaining why I think there is. I think they'll come back to us soon enough, but we haven't been able to make something work there. And I think it really speaks to the persistence you need. Like the reason this worked in California was because I would go drive and show up at the water agency prior to COVID, or go drive and show up at the forest supervisor's office and start asking questions. And that ability to follow through is a little bit more challenging when you're not there in person. But I do think the model could work quite well there. And you do have this uber utility in the Bureau of Rec project, the Salt River project, that I think would and should have a lot to say about this in a much more meaningful way in the future.
Great. We actually have a somewhat of a follow-up question from Christine McKay on this. She had asked, is it possible to sell the wood before? But Christine, you want to ask your follow-up?
Hi, yeah, I'm just curious, is there anything that we can be doing to improve the quality of the timber so that you could get more value out of it?
Yeah, I'd say.
I mean, I'm just wondering, it just blows my mind. I understand you're saying there's some financial return, but not enough to pay for everything.
And it's almost no return. I should be really honest about that. Typically, biomass is transferred off National Forest System land at the legal minimum of 10 cents a ton. So just imagine how many tons it would take before you're getting to $4 million. There's not that much biomass in the whole Tahoe National Forest of the state of California, probably. So that's one of the things that I mean. But the other piece of this is, what are our ecological goals, right? In the Tahoe National Forest, the forest plan says we're not going to go harvest anything that's above 30 inches in diameter. And I think that's really important, because in California, and I don't know how much folks know about this, but we basically clear cut all our national forests. We took all of the big timber off there. There's very, very little old growth. And that's what's really valuable, because when you're milling a log, milling a whole bunch of 18-inch logs is a lot more work, and you get a lot less out of it than you would a 60-inch log or a 70 or an 80-inch log. And these things exist in California, right? And that's when these softwood species, the pine and the fir species that we get a lot of, that's when they become valuable, when they're much larger. But at the same point in time, if we don't see successional growth or second growth here, we're not going to have healthy watersheds, right? So a lot of this goal of this work is say, take out the small diameter trees. So when a fire comes through, that larger tree that we need to be in here, because it's sequestering a lot more carbon, it's going to be more durable. That carbon's going to be more stable, and so is all of the watershed from that perspective. So there are some valuable trees out there. We are just choosing from an ecological standpoint not to cut them down, because we need to see that second growth come in after really, really poor management practices for quite some time.
Yeah, and I would add that one of the things we saw when we were doing some models around this early on was that people often forget the costs of actually getting the wood to market. And if the wood is not valuable, and when it gets to market, or not that valuable, those costs can easily overwhelm whatever you get at the end of the day, and particularly when it is small diameter timber. And I think there was a lot of hope that biomass or things like that would help solve that, and that you would get more money. I don't think anybody has really been able to solve that conundrum.
Not yet.
And even they were talking about milling on the spot, and having movable mills, and different approaches to getting it off the land. I don't think anybody has solved that. I would ask. Well, there was a question that was related to this. Shawana Humphreys, if you wanna ask your question or ask a follow up. I know you had a couple of questions up there.
Thank you. Yeah. Hi, Zach. Hi, Ricardo. Thanks so much, Zach, for this presentation. This is really great. I am curious to know what is happening to the biomass that's coming out of the forest. I'm working with a group to set up, looking at setting up a campus for utilizing small diameter wood, Camptonville. and just really, talking about the difficulties in getting that going and making that viable. And yeah, so I'm curious to know what is happening with this wood right
You're
now.
in our backyard. So the second project that we're working on right now is designed to provide fuel to the Camptonville Community Partner project that I know is not up and running, and a lot of things need to happen there. But the project itself will produce over 30,000 bone-dry tons a year, and I think that facility, if it was up and running, could take maybe somewhere between 12 and 15. So this is something, taking a huge step back, I want to bring up for everybody on this call. What the state of California is doing currently is subsidizing taking that biomass off the forest and burning it to create electricity. It's not a great carbon outcome, but it's a lot better than the alternative, which is leave it in a pile in the forest and burn it when the risk of that sort of spreading across the whole forest gets to be dramatically less. And these piles that remain after the project, some of them are as small as sort of 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet, but the bigger ones can be 30 feet by 30 feet by 30 feet. So they can be quite a bit larger, and that can be a really challenging thing to burn. So if we can get this material off the landscape, that's an ideal situation, even if we're not doing something that's tremendously valuable. And the state of California said, we'll subsidize the point of combustion. We'll pay you $200 a megawatt hour if you burn this stuff and it comes from a high hazard area, which is a good subsidy. I wish they'd subsidize doing something else and just combusting it, but those facilities are going to be on a site, and the hope is that we can bring all of the wood to those sites, way more than one of these facilities could use, and that will start some additional wood products businesses that could do things like veneers, oriented strand board, handful of other value-added wood products like that, that actually keeps more of this carbon sequestered. Pyrolysis plus biochar is another option in this. So there's a lot of technologies out there, but if you don't get all these things into the same place, Ricardo's point about the transportation cost of that wood is going to make all of this stuff uneconomical from that standpoint. So it's not a lot of money to be made here necessarily, but there is a way to strategically build these campuses such that one person is worried about the supply, not 20 businesses, which becomes horribly inefficient.
Thanks.
Yeah, we have a slightly different question coming from Jim Corboy. Jim, do you want to ask your question? Jim, are you still there? Okay, so I'll read his question. How will all the investment and work on this effort aid the employment needs and economic recovery in a post-COVID and drought fire zone and safer 2021-2022? And thanks for another great event.
Yeah, just want to say I can't stress the importance when you're working with a state government, for instance, in terms of talking about jobs. So I mentioned earlier on this call that Sierra County, where a lot of this work is happening, and I don't think it's much better in Yuba County, which is the next one over, had an unemployment rate of 15.5% when we were well under 3% from a statewide perspective. Obviously, everything's gotten worse from COVID. These rural areas are no exception to that. But where we stand right now, if we look at this whole thing as a system, think about the Forest Resilience Bond as one part of the system, the bioenergy facilities and other pieces as another part of the system. Another piece of that is the contractors that are hired to do this work. In the state of California, we do not have enough people to do this work. We need to train folks, and the training can be really variable. There's things like chainsaw certification, which you can do in a day or a weekend. And you don't need a high school degree or a college degree or any of that stuff to do this work, which is, I think, a really good fit for people that want to work in the woods. Then we have in the middle, heavy machinery operating, where you might need to train for 6 months, do another apprenticeship for 6 months before you're able to use any of that equipment. And then in the longest term is the folks that actually put fire on the ground. It can take 3 to 5 years to get a red card, and you're well paid if you're someone that can do that and manage these fires. So, and it takes years to get that. So we have jobs where you can train for a weekend to ones where you need to train for 5 years. And we actually wrote a piece with the Forest Service in the San Francisco Federal Reserve, their community investment review that they do, talking about how financing these projects and giving greater certainty to those contractors can be a really good thing for making sure we're hiring local folks. What often happens in these big Forest Service projects is they set a really big contract, the local crews can't reply to it, so big out-of-state contractors come in, and then we're not actually building this restoration economy in these local areas that we really want to see. And I'd be happy to share that article with you all. I was just an author, I didn't write it, but the author is a wonderful, wonderful writer, and getting into all the details about where these jobs might exist and what we can do, not even from a policy perspective, just in our daily course of action to create more of those jobs.
Yeah, and maybe as we realize in this post-COVID world that we don't have to be, in one place working. We can work everywhere. Maybe there's going to be more people out closer to the forest, which on the one hand is a problem from the wildlife urban barrier and the burning of side, but might be part of the solution, because if you bring the use of the wood to where the wood is, then it can be interesting. I don't know. Anyway, we have a couple of more questions. I've been asked to read them because of connections. So let me start by asking Waylon Matson's question, which says, how much has your agreements or contracts with your partners changed as your timeline has increased from 4 to 8 years? And what changes need to happen moving forward to secure the 20-year commitments that you really need to scale this up?
It's such a great question. So in the first project, we did 4 and 5 year commitments respectively because of how much work was happening on the landscape and how long it would take. We're doing probably 8 years on the next project, more because of that than anything else. So it's really related to how long does it take to do the work and how long do the benefits of this work persist. Those are the two things that we look at when we're trying to determine the payback. And again, I want to stress that one project doesn't have to finish before the next one can start, even if they're in the same watershed from that perspective. So I think that's an important point to touch on there. Does that answer that question, Ricardo, or should we shift it a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I guess some of it is that, and some of it is also from the perspective of investors, I would imagine, what the timing to maturity of their loans and liquidity of their loans, how does that change? And is that a material factor, do you think, or do you think they're comfortable with these longer term loans?
So it's interesting, and I don't want to be too much of a finance nerd, so help me translate some of this, Ricardo, but even though we might have a longer tenor, the duration of this loan is quite short, meaning the risk as interest rates move or the time it takes for them to get a lot of their principal payments back is really, really short, because we actually don't, borrow the money at once and pay it all back at the end. We borrow it over time and we pay it back over time as those cash flows come in. So even though it could have an 8 year final on the next project, we would look at a weighted average life or a duration that was well inside of 2 years. So it still functions as a short-term investment from that perspective.
Great. Yeah, no, I think that's interesting, that structure, as opposed to people think of a loan, they think, oh, all the money comes in the beginning and then you pay it back at a certain time. But it doesn't have to be that way. There's lots of different ways to structure loans. Right?
Ricardo, like we can turn down the fear dial by paying back investors much, much sooner. That's less risk for them. So they can turn the greed dial down a little bit too if we do that.
And we have another question from Andrew Fang related to that, which is, hi, Zach, what was the process used to determine and differentiate the interest rates?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you have a little bit less leeway when you're doing something the first time, I would say. In any loan or fixed income financing, you do what's called building a syndicate or building a book of business. So we would talk to a number of different investors who might be interested in this, and we would do another thing called a roadshow, which is where you go out and you actually either meet with a number of these investors at once or meet with them on an individual basis. Then we take in where their interest is. I would do 2 million of this if it came at 5%. I'd only do 1 million if it came at 4%. So it's a lot more art than science when you're building a book to understand where your interest is. And you will have some investors that express interest in this, but don't get to be part of the financing, either because it's just too small, which was our big problem in this first one, or the return profile didn't match what they needed from that perspective. So it's a little bit of a non-answer, but that's just how a lot of this kind of stuff works in finance. You go and you talk it at a certain rate and say, we think it's going to come in between 3.5% and 4.5%. And then you start to take indications of interest at each one of those levels. And that will allow you to know, as the underwriter or the person that's managing this financing, at what rate could you finance the whole thing? What's the lowest rate for your stakeholders that you could achieve based on those conversations with investors?
Yeah, and I think it's also relative to the other side of the equation, which is what interest can you get from the people who are borrowing the money. In this case, it was not really from the borrowers, but from the utility who was getting the service. So you have to kind of back channel to figure out how much you might be able to get. And then I imagine you also looked at PRIs from foundations that they've done in the past. What interest have those paid back at? Kind of like they've generally been around that 1% number. That tends to be where they fall. So you look at that, and then the broader environment, which you mentioned, of what are treasuries selling at and what are traditional loans selling at. I think we're in an interesting period here where, as you said, on the one hand, it's great because you have to pay less interest. On the other hand, it gets tough because if you're going to propose this to a government agency or a municipality and saying, hey, we'll give you a great interest rate because we have 1% money from a foundation, and they turn to you and say, well, I can go to the market and get half that interest rate, it makes it more difficult to sell them on something like this. So there's lots of dials you're playing with to try and come up with that number.
The funding ones are the biggest though, Ricardo. It's getting that utility and those other stakeholders together. In terms of like the rate for the state, I can show that the state's money still goes at 0%. So even if the blended rate is a little higher, I don't think that's going to have a real big impact on what we're doing. We did get asked from every utility. The treasurer sits in on one meeting. What's the rate? Okay, I fund here. Okay, that's better. Even though they're not really paying that rate when you think about it, right? And I'm really excited to see what the overall cash expense from interest is, because I think when you look at this and say 150 grand over $4 million for 5 years, and you work out what that would be if I had borrowed that money for the whole time, massively different in terms of total cash outlay. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, and I think those are all the questions we've got. I mean, I think what's interesting here is a couple of things. One is the mechanism itself, I think, is super innovative to address a problem that I think is in dire need of being addressed, and that is making headlines every day now all around the world. So that's awesome. But I think there's a tremendous amount of lessons here in terms of, like, how do you start a pilot? How do you create something new? How do you think of an idea in this conservation finance, and how you pivot from,
right.
Originally it's going to be the Forest Service. No, it doesn't work with the Forest Service. There are laws
right.
that prevent this, that, or the other. We're never going to get Congress to approve a change to that. Okay, let's pivot. Let's get a utility in. Let's find out who else are the beneficiaries. And I think where you ended up on after the pivot is really fascinating, because what you've done essentially is, you've created a syndicate of people who benefit from an environmental action. So, protecting the forest, it's not just the Forest Service that benefits. It's insurers, it's the utilities, it's the water play, it's the carbon play, it's the climate play. How do we bring all of those interests, those co-benefits of an activity, to bear to put money into this? And we kind of learned a little bit from that in some work we're doing with WRI, with the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, where we've tried to get them to implement green infrastructure, and they're doing it. But one problem is that the water agency in San Francisco cares only about water. The transportation agency cares only about transportation. But lo and behold, green infrastructure helps manage transportation, addresses water. So rather than having a project be just paid for by the water, can you get it paid for by the water, by the transportation, by the parks department, by other government departments? So we've called it a joint benefits authority, because there's lots of joint benefits that come from this, but it is effectively a very similar structure of getting all of the beneficiaries of one activity to pay into and get something out. So, even though it wasn't where we had originally started with this idea way back when, I think the pivots have made it in many ways more interesting, more appropriate, and potentially able to really, take things beyond this. We're getting a few more questions. One is, I'll let you ask it. Viviana Lujan Gallegos, you want to ask your question?
Can you hear me now?
Viviana.
Yes.
Yep,
Yes,
we hear
great.
you.
Yes, I was just saying good morning and how interesting this has been so far. No, when I was hearing you, I've been working with conservation trust funds for over the past year, and I was wondering whether you have had any conversations with conservation trust funds outside the US for which this model could be relevant, because what you can see is that they're also starting to do impact investment with their own endowment funds or the returns for their endowments, which they have been able to set aside. So they would be, I think, a really good investor for the stack because of course of the risk and return profile they would seek. So I was just curious if you had any discussions with any of them.
So we haven't with them. We did spend a little bit of time with one potential investor in Mexico that was a foundation that said we'd be interested. They don't have PRIs because it's a US tax law, it doesn't Mexico. But they said we'd be interested in investing because we want to learn more about how to do this and actually take this down to Mexico, Central America, South America, with a lot of their bottling facilities. And they thought it could be a really interesting tool from that standpoint. So I think there's this, you get the market rate of return if you're a market rate investor, which is great, but sharing the lessons and how to do this, I think is also incredibly valuable. And I think we should always talk too, and I should have done this at the beginning, Ricardo, when you think about how water funds, for example, have been used in South America, you hear how they're all investors. The utility, the other groups that care and want to see the outcomes. We actually use the term investors as the ones that provide capital, and we use the term beneficiaries as the groups that actually ultimately pay into these structures and pay those investors back. So that's one little language piece that may be a little bit different. That's because our investors provide financing, where those beneficiaries provide the funding. And that, to Ricardo's earlier point, that's the hardest piece, is lining up that payback for the investors.
Great. Well, seeing no more questions pop up, and I think our time is coming to an end. I wanted to thank everybody, thank the Kinship Foundation for making this possible. Thank you guys for attending. Thank you, Zach, in particular, for spending time with us on what I know is very busy times for you guys. Really appreciate the in-depth look at what's been going on and this idea, and also sort of you willing to share the sort of ups and downs of coming up with an idea, changing it, thinking it through, seeing what works and what might not work. So that's always extremely useful. And just wanted to also give a shout out to Ceci Simon, who helped make these case studies possible. Thank you to you and to all of you. And a couple of people have sent a note, Zach, saying, yes, please absolutely share the SF Fed Reserve study paper. We'd very much like to see it. I don't know if you're okay having people email you. We're happy to share your email if you're okay with it. Great. And then also this has been recorded, so you can check out the recording or send the recording to people, and let us know if you have any sort of conservation finance case study that you would like to see profiled here. Send us a note, and we'll try to make it happen. We're still working on a couple of people for next month in November, which I think will be interesting from a variety of different perspectives. So we'll let you know as soon as we've got somebody confirmed for November. But again, if you have any ideas of people who should be featured, please shoot us an email. And thanks again, everybody, and see you next month. Thanks, Zach.
Thanks, folks. Thanks, Ricardo.